Y'all, somehow this is the last episode of the Page and Podium podcast for 2025. And as we round out what has been a pretty challenging year, I thought there was no better way to welcome in 2026 than to warn you about 6 of the biggest mistakes I see among new book authors. Stay tuned. Writers often feel called to write a book because they've read something that truly moved, inspired, or changed them. We all feel we have something true to share, but it makes it so intimidating when we're trying to create something that is just as moving and inspiring as that book that changed us. Learning to read like a writer reveals the underlying structure of narrative, showing how and why it speaks to us. It demystifies the process and helps us make decisions for our own work. That's why we started the Page and Podium Book Club. Not just to read lovely memoirs with lovely women, but also to understand how these books work. Each month, we break down a published memoir to see what it's doing under the surface, and your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up. As I was deciding what we wanted to do for this last episode of 2025, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the kinds of conversations that we've had on this podcast over this year. And one of the things that I realized is, as much as I love to talk about things like structure, to talk about things like publishing and the practicalities and logistics of that, one of the things that I really want to make sure that I emphasize is that actually a lot of the challenges that you are likely to come up against as a first-time book author are not things that have to do with the technicalities. They're not things that have to do with the logistics necessarily. Often they are the kinds of things that we don't notice because we are so close to the work. And that's what I want to go into today. Really, as we are tackling these top 6 mistakes, I really want you to focus on the way that these are not things that have to do with your knowledge or not, your skill or not. And in fact, every single one of the things on this list is something that I have experienced myself. So as we go through, I do want to give you some examples from clients, people that we've worked with, both in the Memoir Method, our group program for women who are working on their memoirs, as well as things we have seen in ghostwriting clients, things that we have seen in our one-on-one coaching program, Editor in Your Pocket, and things that we have seen in ourselves, in our own staffs, as we have been working through our own projects and projects that we care about very deeply, but that are for our clients. So moving through here, one thing that I do want you to keep in mind is that as we're going through, what I'm really asking you to do here is think about your mindset. Now, oftentimes what I see is that the folks that I talk to, really their main goal is that they want to make sure that their book is really good. There is nothing scarier than thinking that you are going to embark on this journey of writing your first book, a journey that we know takes a long, long time, and imagining that at the end, you come out with something that's not very good. Oh, that hurts my heart to think about, so I totally feel y'all. And one of the things that I really see a lot is that the way we end up with a book that wouldn't be very good, now, obviously, these are our clients, we're intervening, but the way that we can end up with a book that's not very good, especially when we don't have that outside perspective, is that we keep on going in ways that make us doubt ourselves. So as you are thinking about this, a lot of these come down to your relationship to yourself and your relationship to your project. So keep this one in your back pocket. I think this is going to be an evergreen episode that you can revisit again and again whenever you feel like you're stuck, whenever you feel like there is no point in writing this book, and especially whenever you feel that little bit of fear in your gut, that fear that tells you this is not going to be a good book. It's not worth it. You've just got to put it aside and forget about it, oftentimes, again, after having done that several times before. So with that, let's get into it. What are the top 6 mistakes that I see among first-time book authors? Well, the first one is one that I experienced myself just the other day, and that is you will know that you are not on the right track if what you are doing is promising yourself that you will write more and more and more and more to get things done faster. Now, as I said, I experienced this just the other day. I am working on a newish memoir project. I'm about halfway through at this point, a little bit more. But one thing that I noticed I was starting to say a lot to my friends and family was, oh, you know what? This weekend, I might write 3 chapters. Or, oh my gosh, you know what? Over Christmas break, I bet I can grab a week and I bet I can do another writing retreat and just knock it out. And for me, it's phrases like that, the knock it out or the butt in seat or get it done, that always, always, always signal that I am on the wrong track. And here's why. When we put so much pressure on ourselves to get this book done quickly, what we are doing is robbing ourselves of what we need to do the book well. Now, don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that a good book has to be slow. It doesn't, not at all. Rather, what I want you to hear me say is that when you focus so much on getting the book done, you are going to necessarily lose the focus that you need on enjoying the process. Unfortunately, as much as I wish we could butt in seat our way to an excellent book, my experience has been the more you try to push yourself in this way that favors efficiency, productivity, over the creative expression that that book needs, the more likely that book is going to feel like a robot wrote it. The more likely that that book is not going to feel the way you want it to feel, because readers can sense when you have rushed through the process. The other issue with this kind of butt in seat, knock it out type of philosophy is that when we are coming from a perspective that is only valuing the fast version, getting things done quickly, what very often happens is that we don't give ourselves the space to really think and feel and intuit what we need to be doing in that book. Instead, we will hold ourselves to whatever the plan is at all costs. So, what does this look like? Well, sometimes it does look like trying to knock out a whole bunch, more than maybe you think that you should. But sometimes it also looks like rigidly holding to the plan because something like adding a chapter, adding a scene, expanding what you're talking about in a particular section is necessarily going to slow down your timeline. But of course, it is much, much more important that our timeline is a little slower and that we are able to say the things we want to say in the way we want to say them than that we knock it out by some truly arbitrary metric. I know I also want to finish my book by the end of this year, but sometimes it's just not going to happen. So, one of the top mistakes that I see, the one that I wanted to open this video with, is that urge to be quick instead of good. I know we don't usually think of it that way, but if you are finding that you are being so caught up in the efficiency that you're not enjoying the process, really let that flag something in you. We've got to reevaluate what we're doing because we have to make sure that there is that room and the space. And even if you're writing something heavy, the joy of getting that book out. So, all right, the first thing is I don't want you to prioritize this efficiency, productivity over your creativity. And if that is something that resonates, if that is something that you want to think a little bit more about, we do have an episode from probably 3-4 months ago at this point called Productivity versus Creativity. You can hear a little bit more about how I think about those two competing, in my opinion, concepts. All right. Number 2, the second thing that you might be doing that is going to take your book away from the point that you want it to be is rigidly clinging to stuff that you have already written. Now, this can be a whole draft. In fact, that is often where we will see this problem crop up, but it also could be in terms of blog posts that you have published, notes that you have taken, scenes that you have jotted down. Any content that pre-exists this particular period of writing for you can often crop up and cause us to have this kind of inflexibility that truly is never, ever going to help your book, and in fact, can totally derail your progress. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what this looks like, because we actually had a pretty recent example that I think is such a good example of this. This was in our one-on-one coaching program. It's called Editor in Your Pocket. Every week you would meet with a book coach, and every week you will submit some writing for that coach to look over, give you feedback on, go over together, just generally have a partner as you move through the process of writing. Now, this particular client is working on a hybrid memoir. That's our specialty, meaning that she is bringing her training and professional expertise into conversation with her own personal story. Now, this is the most powerful way to share your expertise, in my opinion, because we not only get all of this information that you know from being the expert, from living in this professional world, but we also get it in a way that often resonates more, is more emotional, feels more connected than if we just shared that information. We've got the story. The story often ends up being the vehicle to make that information much, much easier to understand, much, much easier to internalize. And of course, it also builds a relationship between the reader and the author, which is great if you want your reader to reach out for more support. When we're thinking about that type of book, one of the things you got to keep in mind is that there is a lot of play that goes around both the story and the information. Essentially, the real challenge of this type of book, besides all the other challenges of writing any book, is you're really working to balance those two elements. We want to make sure that we don't end up either with the whole first half of your book as story, the whole second half as information. That's very, very common. But we also want to make sure that within each chapter, there does feel like a logical flow between story, information, back and forth, and so on. Well, this particular client had come up upon a point where she was really struggling with that. She had a chapter that had ended up being very, very information dense, but she had a lot of different kind of story information that she could add to it as well. Now, as she was working with her book coach, and she was working with Emily in this case, as she was working with her book coach, one of the things that came up was that when Emily looked at it, she said, I think you've got 2 chapters. I think you've got all of this information, but it's really kind of 2 different pieces of information. And as I hear you talking about where this information kind of came from, where it applies, how you've seen it show up in your everyday life, you have plenty of stories to expand this single chapter into 2. Well, for a couple of weeks, actually, and this client is very, very fast, for a couple of weeks, what was happening was that the client was really trying to put the stories into the chapter as it stood. Emily realized right away, Emily had told her from the very beginning, probably you're going to have to just rewrite this. Probably we need to plan 2 new chapters, plug in as much information as we can, but also give ourselves the flexibility to let this be new material, new writing. Now, I understand why this client's response was to really kind of push back on that, see if there was any other possible way. Because what very, very often happens is that when we have written part of a draft, we have such a deep resistance to getting rid of any of it. That is work on the page, and of course it feels terrible to think that you have wasted time on something. But unfortunately, this is a great example of the sunk cost fallacy, meaning that as you go through and try to do your revision stage of your book, you've really got to be willing to let go of some of that previous material, not because it wasn't good, not because it's not valuable, but because the purpose of that material was not to go straight into your book as is. The purpose of that material was to help you figure out what you wanted to say. So often that's the case with the first draft. But when we get so tied to what our original draft was that we can't give ourselves freedom and flexibility, we really do ourselves a huge disservice. And of course, in the end, this client did finally realize that Emily was right. She really did need to separate this chapter into 2. And once she did that, y'all, she wrote both those chapters in 1 week. It wasn't even hard. So once we can let go of that past material, once we allow ourselves to realize that sometimes our drafting is not meant to go in the book. Sometimes our drafting is just meant to serve the thinking process. And once we get there, oftentimes there is such freedom. Oftentimes it feels like something has been unblocked or unstuck. And oftentimes we're able to finally move forward, not because we kept all that material, but because we got rid of it. So that is number 2. So often we are clinging to our material. Really, we've just got to let it go. All right, number 3, the third way that you can tell you are in trouble is that you're too stuck on the idea of right versus wrong. Now, I see this especially in high-achieving women, especially in writers that went through the school system, really doing well, being the star student, being really rewarded and really given a lot of praise for doing things right. Of course, who doesn't love to be praised for doing things right? But the problem is when we get so stuck on right versus wrong, particularly when we're talking about our creative pursuits, we very often hamstring ourselves. So let me give you an example. How does this show up? Well, this is a really, really common conversation that we have both with our one-on-one clients and in the group memoir coaching program, the Memoir Method. And that is that even though we do insist that you put an outline together before you get started, as you all know, I am so big on structure and we have got to have an outline, especially for memoir. But even though we insist on you putting that structure together, one thing that we emphasize throughout the development and really throughout the program is that that structure is not meant to be a cage. Sometimes when we make ourselves a plan, we are really just building a prison around ourselves. And this is where this right versus wrong comes in. One thing that we hear so often is that folks will bring a question into the group program, and really the crux of the question is it wrong to deviate from my outline? I've got this structure. I have everything in place. Of course, in the group program, there is a step-by-step guide for how to move through each stage of development, not just a how-to, but also the way to think about this philosophically to make sure your structure works. But as we go through all that, we still make super, super sure to emphasize that yes, you're putting a structure together, but that your structure will be flexible. One of the metaphors that I love that Emily uses all the time is that we need to think of our outline as a guide. Think of it like plans for travel. When you are planning a big, say, international trip, it makes the most sense to do some planning. We've got to, of course, make sure we've got a flight, we've got a place to stay. Maybe there's a place we want to eat dinner, we need a reservation. Maybe we want to make sure we catch a play, we need tickets, whatever it might be. Of course, we want to do that planning. But what if you land at that place and realize that there's a huge festival happening? What if there's like a craft fair? I love a craft fair that you could catch just because you happen to be in town at that time. Well, oh my goodness, we're going to scrap our plan, right? We're going to at least consider whether it makes sense to deviate a bit to catch this unexpected fun thing. The same exact thing is true of your outline and your plan. But oftentimes, as we're going through that plan, if we feel like we're doing it right, and especially if we feel that we're kind of tenuously doing it right, that we're doing it right, but we're not really sure why, oftentimes what happens is that can backfire in such a way that we really feel like we need permission for every single change we might make. We are so afraid to get it wrong that what we end up doing is stopping ourselves from being able to do it right. And this is why I wanted to point this out as our third mistake. So common that we will get so hung up in the idea of what's right versus what's wrong that we won't allow ourselves to move forward with the freedom that we need for any kind of creative expression. And really that leads me in so neatly into number 4, which is you will know you are in trouble if you're not trusting your intuition. Now, as I said, this is kind of a sister to number 3, but I think it's worth its own thing because we had such a good example of this in the Memoir Method the other day, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is so common and it is such a good example. So one of our members is working on a memoir. This memoir, I am so excited for this memoir, let me say. I don't want to give any spoilers, but just to give kind of a general sense, this is a person who is writing about their experience of kind of living through the same progressive disease, both from their mother and then later in their sister, and kind of seeing how many things that they learned through that process, kind of reflecting on the ways that they were changed through the process of the trauma of seeing their mother go through that, and then having it come back up with their sister. It's a really, really complex, beautiful, beautiful book. And we have, as we do with all of our Memoir Method members, we have, Emily and I both reviewed that person's outline. We went through it, we gave them feedback. It is such a good plan. But as I just teased in the last item, when we're going through the actual writing process, very often we've got to give ourselves some flexibility. Well, this is such an excellent member of this program. She is so on top of all of it. She is so immersed in the program. So what she brought us as a question was, she said, I know it's okay to deviate from the outline. I know that's okay. But as I'm writing, I'm really feeling like I want to break the chapter here and not here where I had originally planned, but then is that going to kind of complicate? Is that going to run into everything else? So of course, as we often do, we asked some follow-up questions. We tried to really get at the heart of what she was asking. And as she talked, it was so clear to me that her intuition was telling her to break the chapter at that point. That actually it wasn't subtle. That as she was writing, she could just feel that that's where the chapter break went. She hadn't planned it that way, but that's so common. So often when we're doing that plan, we really can't figure out what exactly things are going to look like. We're doing our best to put together this outline because we do need a structure. But when your intuition is telling you that you need to do something different, that is such a gift. When we are thinking about creative expression, when we're thinking about any of these kind of long-term projects that take so much of our wisdom and our energy and our skill and our life, one thing that we've really got to be open to is the fact that we actually know how to do it. We actually know what is right. And I see this again and again. It often does take, I will tell you, in that group program that we run in the Memoir Method, it often does take 4 or 5 months before people really start to feel that intuition, really are able to feel their way through. But we want to encourage this at all times. Even if you are a brand new writer, the best way to really stoke that intuition, the best way to really trust yourself is just simply to practice it. Just simply to pick up on when you've got that little pulse of intuition and really lean into it. So if this is you, I want you to trust yourself. That is such a key part of really any type of book writing, but particularly if you are working on a memoir or some other deeply personal project, you've got to be ready to trust yourself. It's just part of it. Okay, number 5, our second to the last overarching mistake that I see so often in so many writers is you get stuck in your audience's head. Now, as with all of these, this is such an understandable response, especially as you start to get later in the book, as it starts to be real. Very, very, very often, one thing that will happen at this stage is that folks will start to really doubt themselves, but in a way that focuses on what the audience will think. And because I think most of the folks that tune into this channel regularly, whether it's YouTube, podcast, or the blog, tend to be memoir writers, I want to give you a memoir example here. This is so common in memoir, by the way. So when you are writing a memoir, it is almost guaranteed that there will be something in that book that you did that is not very flattering. Something that you did that if you had it to do again, you would never, ever do it in this way. Almost all of us has this. And in fact, if you want your reader to relate to you and like you and trust you, you better have some stuff you messed up, because there's nothing worse than a memoir where the author is always right the whole way through. All of us know that's not how the world works. So you will usually have at least a handful of times when you did something that you're not proud of. Well, one thing that happens is as we're going through that, And then we run up against this realization that someone else is going to read this, actually, a lot of someone else's. There's such a temptation to think about what your audience is going to think and adapt accordingly. And OMG, this is the absolute wrong impulse. When you are writing from a position of what your audience will think, you are literally unable to write from a position of what you think. When you prioritize other people's perspective, especially imagined other people's perspectives, because we don't know what the reader's going to say, you are quite literally leaning into a part of yourself that is a negative part of yourself. Very, very often, what is happening here is it's not what the reader is going to say. It's the mean things you're saying about yourself. So when we get into this position, the thing that I want you to remind yourself of is that there really is no other way to write this book than from your perspective. It's just simply not possible to write a book from someone else's perspective unless you are a trained ghostwriter who is trying specifically to do that. And it's a real person's perspective, again, not our imagined audience. So, what's the advice here? Well, always, 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 we will suggest that you write for yourself and edit for your audience. So simple, right? So as you are writing, if you're finding yourself really being sucked into your audience perspective, really thinking about, oh my gosh, what are they going to think about me? What are they going to say? How will people respond? If you find yourself in that place, I really want you to pull yourself back and remind yourself that a big part of writing your book is doing something for yourself. A big part of writing your book is leaning into what it is you know. And when you do that, it only increases your confidence. It only makes you feel better as a writer. It only makes you feel better as an expert. And of course, it only makes you feel better as an author, as someone that can stand behind those ideas in the promotion of that book. It's so, so, so important. So if you find yourself stuck in your audience's head, in your reader's head, really want you to pull yourself out of there. It's going to be so, so much easier to evaluate this kind of thing once you've got your whole draft. So let's make that audience adaptation step a second draft problem. Let's go through that after we've got everything on paper and we can really objectively see what's on the page. I promise you, you will have so much more clarity at that point, and you can make so sure that what you're saying is what you want to say and not what your imagined inner critic is telling you to say. All right, last but not least, my favorite tip. Truly, this is my favorite tip, and I love every time I get to share it. You will know you are not on track if you are not celebrating your wins. All right, don't turn off the video, don't turn off the podcast, I promise. This is so important. It's not fluff, it's not cheerleading. This is a key part to finishing any book, and as someone who has written dozens, I can tell you, if I lose that step, if I don't celebrate the steps of the process, I so quickly become demoralized, and I see it in my clients too. So, what do I mean by this? Well, let me give you an example. So, something that happens pretty regularly is that when you finish a writing session, if there's any sense of that urgency that I started this video out with, if there's any sense of wanting to hit some kind of a deadline, very, very often, we will finish a chapter, we will finish a revision, whatever it is we're working on. And rather than saying, yay, chapter 9 is done, rather than that, we will say, oh, I really wanted to get to chapter 10 though. I do it to myself all the time. So again, this is not judgment. This is a totally normal part of human nature. And in fact, I have quite literally seen adding a celebration practice to your writing routine take authors to the next level. Let me give you an example here. This is one of my book coaching clients, one of my clients from Editor in Your Pocket, and she was writing a general nonfiction, so not a memoir, a general nonfiction book, leaning a little bit toward the academic side, thinking about her expertise as a PhD scholar researcher. So this is a book that she had started 15 years ago, I believe. She'd picked it back up during COVID, but then it fell by the wayside again, and she had come to me because this was kind of the last shot. In fact, she told me on that consult, you are literally my last hope. If you can't help me get through this, I'm just gonna put it away. Oh, I hate to hear it. You all know I hate to hear it. So I said, that's all right. Let's do it. Spoiler alert, we did. She did get that book done. She got it to her editor. It's off to the presses. We love it so very much. But one of the things that made the difference is that when we were on those weekly calls, I noticed that week after week after week, I would ask her, how is it going? Give me an update. That's usually how we'll get started. And she would apologize, but then tell me all the things she had done. And often they were like pretty major things. Now, the thing to remember is this was mostly a revision project. She had a lot of it drafted. And revision is actually very, very hard to track. When we think about writing the first draft, we can set word count, page goals, however you like to think about that. Revision's a little trickier. And we do actually have a previous episode on this, so you can go back and look at the episode that's how to track your progress when you're not writing. That episode can be really helpful if you're either in the development, outlining stage, or the revision stage. But suffice it to say, in this case, she was not giving herself credit, even for pretty major revisions. Well, what I said was, we have got to build in celebration. And in fact, one of the things I told her to do, one of the things that I am telling you to do, is once you get near that finish line, I want you to figure out what your celebration will be, and I want you to book something in celebration. For her, she needed to finish that whole draft. She needed to get it off to the editor. So what I said was, let's set the date. We set it. We made ourselves a little plan for how we were going to move through, how we were going to get everything done in the time we had. And then when we were about 6 weeks, a month out, it was so clear to me that she was going to be fine. And I said, I want you to make reservations at a restaurant now. She did not want to do that. She thought she was jinxing herself. But what I will tell you is having that goal, realizing that at the end, you are doing something so big, that will drive you forward so much more quickly than anything else. Certainly much more quickly than butt in seat, knock it out mentality. So I don't just mean this, by the way, when we're talking about the big major finale point, although definitely celebrate that. One piece of advice that I give every single client is you have got to celebrate every little win. When you start out to write a book, especially your first book, you really have no sense of what the path is going to look like, and most people will really underestimate what it's going to take out of them. That means we cannot do 20 chapters, more or less, whatever, all while beating ourselves up. So the good news is we have 20 built-in points to celebrate. At the end of every single chapter, you can do a little something for yourself, whether that is order yourself the fancy latte at the coffee shop, whether that is go out to dinner, whether that is simply announcing to your friends and or family that you got another chapter done, that you are on track, you are sticking to your schedule. However big or small that celebration is, I promise you, that celebration is telling your brain that you are on track. And when our brains think we're on track, we are on track. We are pretty amazing like that as human creatures. And anytime we believe something to be true, we will naturally and intuitively take steps to make it true. This is just part of how we behave. It's part of human psychology. So let's lean into that. Let's give our brains real concrete evidence that yes, you are right. I am doing this thing. And I'm doing it so well. And I think that is the perfect note to wrap up another year of the Page and Podium podcast. So thank you all so much for being with us for these years. It really means so much to me when we will hear from people that this podcast, this YouTube channel, our blog is really changing the way that you write. So if you are in that boat, if this podcast has been helpful to you, I hope that you will help us out. Help us find other people who need us. Leave a rating, leave a review, subscribe, share, tell your friends, whatever it is that you are called to do. I hope that you will help support us as we move into a really exciting 2026. And in the meantime, I hope that you will find plenty of space to celebrate, even in this kind of difficult year. There is so much joy, there is so much beauty, and we have got to cling to that. And with that, I will see you in 2026. Happy writing. You've been writing your memoir, maybe even for years. You know your material, you know what it means. What's missing isn't the story, it's the structure. And that's why we started the Memoir Method Book Club. Every single month, Emily Thrash, a professional writer and editor, teaches you how to read like a writer by breaking down a published memoir and showing you what it's doing under the surface. Your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up.